Fear is often described as personal, subjective, a matter of taste. That assumption is convenient but incorrect. In cinema, fear is not a feeling that happens by accident. It is not the result of a shocking image or an extreme idea. It is the outcome of specific technical decisions repeated with discipline and restraint. Camera placement determines what the audience is allowed to know. Sound design decides when tension enters the body. Editing controls how long uncertainty is permitted to exist. Silence is used not as absence, but as pressure. When these elements are arranged precisely, fear emerges whether the viewer wants it to or not. This is why certain horror films remain effective long after their stories are familiar. Not because their plots are frightening, but because their construction is. They do not rely on spectacle or escalation. They rely on limitation, on withholding, on forcing the audience to participate in the act of fear-making. This video is not about what these films are about. It is about how they work. Each entry examines one deliberate technical choice, one mechanism that shapes the viewer's perception and controls emotional response. These films are not successful because they try harder. They are successful because they are engineered with precision. By removing emotion from the analysis, something becomes clear. Fear is not expressive. Fear is structural. And once you begin to see horror films as designed systems rather than stories, their effectiveness becomes measurable. These films work not because of what they show, but because of how they are built. 1. Messiah of Evil, 1973. Messiah of Evil operates through spatial continuity breakdown. The film disrupts geographic logic. Locations connect without clear transition. Physical spaces feel adjacent despite lacking spatial justification. Movement between settings occurs without establishing orientation. This breakdown removes the audience's ability to map environment reliably. Without spatial continuity, anticipation becomes ineffective. The viewer cannot predict entry points, exits, or boundaries. The mechanism works by eliminating navigational security. Space no longer functions as a stabilizing framework. Instead, it becomes a source of uncertainty, independent of narrative action. The limitation is coherence. Spatial disruption can reduce narrative legibility and create disorientation that some viewers interpret as inconsistency. The film accepts this cost to sustain environmental instability. Here, fear is not attached to a location. It is engineered through spatial unreliability, constructed by deliberate continuity violation. 2. The Brotherhood of Satan, 1971. In The Brotherhood of Satan, fear is constructed through behavioral normalization of threat. The film presents hostile intent through ordinary routines and familiar social behavior. Antagonistic presence is embedded within everyday interactions, avoiding visual or auditory markers typically associated with danger. This normalization delays defensive response. The audience is conditioned to accept behavior as benign until its implications become unavoidable. Threat is not announced, it is integrated. The effectiveness lies in gradual recalibration. As normality persists, the viewer's threshold for suspicion increases. When danger becomes explicit, it violates an established baseline of trust. The trade-off is immediacy. Behavioral normalization reduces early intensity and requires patience. The film sacrifices quick engagement to achieve delayed perceptual disruption. Fear here is not introduced by escalation. It is engineered through extended behavioral plausibility, using familiarity as concealment. 3. Crowhaven Farm, 1970. Crowhaven Farm is built around information asymmetry through dialogue control. The film restricts what characters explicitly state. Conversations are indirect, evasive, and often incomplete. Key beliefs and intentions are implied rather than declared, forcing the audience to infer meaning from tone and omission rather than content. This creates an imbalance between speaker and listener. Characters behave with certainty, while the audience lacks equivalent informational grounding. The viewer is placed in a position of delayed comprehension, processing consequences before causes are fully revealed. The mechanism works because dialogue becomes an obstacle rather than a guide. Speech does not clarify, it conceals. As a result, attention shifts from what is said to what is avoided. Silence and circumlocution carry more weight than exposition. The limitation is accessibility. Indirect dialogue reduces clarity and may alienate viewers who rely on verbal explanation. The film accepts interpretive difficulty to maintain controlled uncertainty. Here, fear is not delivered through confrontation. It is engineered through deliberate conversational restraint, maintaining imbalance by design. 4. Bad Ronald, 1974. Bad Ronald constructs fear through spatial confinement framing. The camera emphasizes enclosed interiors and restricted movement paths. Frames often limit lateral space, compressing the environment visually. Even when characters move freely, the composition reinforces enclosure. This framing conditions the viewer to perceive space as limited. Anticipation builds not from visible threat, but from spatial inevitability. The audience senses constraint before it becomes narratively relevant. The mechanism is effective because it preconditions response. By establishing confinement visually, the film primes anxiety independent of plot progression. Space itself becomes a source of pressure. The limitation is repetition. Persistent spatial compression can reduce visual variety and impact. The film accepts visual monotony to maintain continuous spatial tension. Here, fear is not created by intrusion. It is engineered through pre-existing spatial restriction enforced by compositional control. 5. The Other, 1972. In The Other, fear emerges from environmental normalcy as misdirection. The film presents familiar pastoral settings with minimal visual distortion. Lighting remains naturalistic. Composition favors balance and clarity. Nothing in the environment signals threat directly. This neutrality functions as a control mechanism. By refusing visual markers of danger, the film delays defensive response. The audience lowers vigilance, interpreting stability as safety. When behavioral irregularities appear, they register more strongly against the unchanged environment. The effectiveness lies in contrast without transformation. The setting does not deteriorate alongside the narrative. Instead, it remains constant, forcing the viewer to locate unease within behavior rather than space. The trade-off is immediacy. Environmental neutrality reduces overt tension and may appear uneventful. The film accepts reduced stimulation to amplify later perceptual disruption. Fear here is not embedded in darkness or decay. It is engineered through unchanged surroundings, using stability as concealment. 6. Symptoms, 1974. Symptoms is structured around editing rhythm as psychological pressure. The film employs elongated takes and minimal cutting, allowing scenes to extend beyond conventional narrative necessity. Edits arrive late, often after the audience expects a transition. This delay alters perception of time, creating a sense of stagnation rather than progression. The mechanism works by resisting narrative efficiency. Without rhythmic variation, the viewer cannot rely on editing cues to signal emotional change or relief. Attention is held not by escalation, but by endurance. The audience becomes acutely aware of duration. This sustained stillness increases sensitivity to minor changes. Small movements, slight tonal shifts, subtle performance adjustments. Because the film refuses to punctuate moments with cuts, every detail carries disproportionate weight. The limitation is momentum. Extended duration reduces narrative propulsion and demands patience. The film sacrifices pace to maintain continuous psychological pressure through temporal extension. Here, fear is not intensified through action. It is sustained through temporal drag, engineered by deliberate editorial restraint. 7. The Visitor, 1979. The Visitor operates through tonal instability. The film shifts between modes: science fiction, religious allegory, domestic drama, without establishing a dominant framework. Transitions occur without preparation. Visual language changes without justification. This instability prevents genre-based prediction. The audience cannot rely on established rules to anticipate outcome or threat. Each tonal shift resets expectation, forcing continuous recalibration. The mechanism is effective because it removes interpretive grounding. Without tonal consistency, the viewer cannot apply learned patterns of response. Attention remains heightened not because of escalation, but because orientation is repeatedly disrupted. The trade-off is cohesion. Tonal instability reduces narrative unity and risks fragmentation. The film sacrifices coherence to maintain unpredictability. In this case, fear is not a reaction to content. It is a response to structural inconsistency engineered through deliberate tonal imbalance. 8. Let's Scare Jessica to Death, 1971. In Let's Scare Jessica to Death, fear is built through narrative ambiguity without correction. The film introduces uncertainty early and refuses to resolve it. Information is presented without verification. Conflicting interpretations are allowed to coexist without clarification. The narrative does not provide an authoritative perspective. This design destabilizes viewer trust. Without confirmation, the audience cannot distinguish between internal perception and external threat. The film does not guide interpretation. It withholds validation. The effectiveness lies in duration. Ambiguity is not a temporary device, but a sustained condition. The viewer remains suspended between explanations, unable to settle on a stable reading. The limitation is decisiveness. Persistent ambiguity risks diminishing impact for viewers seeking resolution. The film accepts interpretive discomfort as a necessary consequence of its design. Fear here is not delivered through revelation. It is maintained through unresolved narrative structure constructed by deliberate refusal to explain. 9. Race with the Devil, 75. Race with the Devil is driven by continuous forward motion as a control mechanism. The film minimizes pauses. Dialogue scenes are short. Spatial orientation is often incomplete. The camera favors movement over observation, preventing the audience from settling into a stable viewpoint. Even moments that appear calm are framed as temporary transitional states. This constant motion limits analytical distance. The viewer is denied time to assess threat or context. Instead of evaluating danger, the audience reacts to momentum. Fear emerges from the inability to stop and reorient. The mechanism works because motion suppresses reflection. When the film does not allow stillness, it removes the opportunity for rational reassessment. The viewer remains in a reactive state rather than an interpretive one. The trade-off is depth. Continuous movement reduces thematic exploration and visual complexity. The film sacrifices nuance to maintain pressure through velocity. Here, fear is not constructed through imagery. It is sustained through kinetic constraint, engineered by uninterrupted progression. 10. The Sentinel, 1977. The Sentinel relies on framing restriction as its primary fear mechanism. The camera consistently limits visual access to information the audience expects to receive. Compositions favor partial views, obstructed sightlines, and delayed reveals. Even when the subject of attention is present, the frame denies full inspection. This restriction controls viewer certainty. The audience is forced to process incomplete visual data, increasing vigilance. Attention is directed not by movement or emphasis, but by absence. The viewer searches the frame for confirmation that never fully arrives. The mechanism is effective because it disrupts visual authority. The audience cannot trust what they see to be sufficient. This uncertainty persists even in moments that appear calm, maintaining tension without escalation. The limitation is immediacy. Framing restriction can slow engagement and reduce narrative momentum. The film accepts reduced speed in exchange for sustained visual unease. In this structure, fear is not revealed. It is withheld through composition engineered by deliberate visual limitation. 11. Don't Go to Sleep, 1982. In Don't Go to Sleep, fear is constructed through temporal disorientation. The film repeatedly destabilizes the boundary between present experience and intrusive memory. Transitions between waking life and psychological intrusion are not formally announced. Visual continuity is maintained even as temporal logic shifts, preventing the viewer from identifying clear markers of transition. This technique alters perception rather than narrative. The audience experiences time the way the protagonist does, without reliable separation between now and then. As a result, anticipation replaces suspense. Viewers are less concerned with what will happen next than with whether the present moment is stable. The effectiveness lies in duration. Temporal uncertainty prolongs tension by removing narrative checkpoints. Without clear temporal structure, scenes cannot resolve cleanly. The viewer remains alert, continuously reassessing context. The trade-off is narrative orientation. Temporal disorientation reduces immediate comprehension and risks alienating viewers who rely on linear progression. The film accepts this cost to sustain psychological pressure. Fear here is not introduced through threat. It is sustained through temporal instability built by controlled dislocation. 12. Cry for the Strangers, 1982. Cry for the Strangers functions through off-screen space management. As a television production, the film operates with invisible limitations. Rather than compensating with exposition or explicit imagery, it relies on what is kept outside the frame. Threats are suggested through reaction shots, sound cues, and delayed visual confirmation. The camera often arrives after an event has already occurred. This design shifts the burden of construction onto the viewer. By denying direct access to critical actions, the film forces the audience to assemble the threat mentally. The absence of visual confirmation increases cognitive engagement, as viewers must reconcile cause and effect without complete information. The mechanism is effective because off-screen space creates elasticity. What is unseen remains undefined, allowing the threat to expand beyond what is shown. The audience fills the gaps using expectation rather than evidence. The limitation is clarity. Television framing and broadcast standards restrict how much ambiguity can be sustained before confusion sets in. The film sacrifices explicit causality to preserve tension generated by omission. Here, fear is not placed in the frame. It is engineered in the space the frame refuses to show. 13. The Child, 1977. The Child derives its effect from performance restraint. Rather than exaggerating emotion, performances are deliberately flattened. Reactions are muted. Dialogue is delivered with minimal inflection. Emotional responses often appear delayed or misaligned with events. This creates a behavioral disconnect that unsettles viewer expectations. The audience instinctively searches for emotional cues to interpret threat. When those cues are absent or suppressed, the viewer loses a reliable framework for understanding what is happening. Characters appear calm in situations that suggest distress. This mismatch generates discomfort without explicit danger. The mechanism works because it denies emotional mirroring. Viewers cannot align their reactions with the characters on screen. Instead, they become hyper-aware of behavioral abnormality. The unease comes not from what occurs, but from how little reaction it provokes. The limitation of this technique is distance. Performance restraint reduces immediacy and may weaken empathy. The film accepts emotional detachment as a necessary cost to create behavioral unease. In this case, fear is not performed. It is implied through emotional absence, constructed by deliberate restraint rather than expression. 14. Dark August, 1976. In Dark August, fear is generated through environmental sound control. The film relies heavily on ambient noise rather than musical scoring. Natural sounds wind distant movement. Unexplained audio cues are allowed to dominate the soundscape. Silence is not clean or neutral. It is textured, filled with low-level auditory detail that never resolves into clear signals. This design forces the audience to remain in a state of auditory anticipation. Without musical cues to guide emotional response, viewers must determine threat levels themselves. Every sound carries potential significance, but no sound confirms it. The absence of auditory hierarchy prevents relaxation. The effectiveness lies in how the sound design removes predictability. There is no clear transition between safety and danger. The audience cannot rely on volume or tempo changes to signal escalation. Instead, attention remains constantly engaged, scanning for meaning that may never arrive. The trade-off is pace. This approach slows narrative momentum and resists conventional buildup. For some viewers, the lack of auditory direction may feel uneventful. The film accepts this cost to maintain continuous low-level tension. Here, fear is not introduced through shock. It is sustained through auditory uncertainty, engineered by restraint rather than emphasis. 15. The Premonition, 1976. The Premonition operates primarily through narrative withholding. The film presents a story centered on loss and obsession, but it consistently refuses to clarify emotional motivation at the moment the audience expects it. Information is delayed, sometimes entirely absent. Key relationships are suggested rather than explained. As a result, the viewer is forced to infer meaning from behavior instead of dialogue or exposition. This withholding changes how the audience processes threat. Rather than responding to explicit danger, the viewer responds to instability. Characters appear to act with certainty, while the audience lacks equivalent knowledge. This imbalance creates cognitive tension, the sense that decisions are being made based on information the viewer does not possess. The mechanism is effective because it prevents emotional alignment. The audience cannot settle into sympathy or judgment. Every scene feels provisional, as if it may later be recontextualized. The absence of clarification keeps the viewer alert, continuously reassessing what they believe to be true. However, this approach carries a limitation. Narrative withholding reduces accessibility. Without clear anchors, some viewers disengage, interpreting ambiguity as confusion rather than design. The film sacrifices immediate coherence in exchange for sustained unease. The result is a horror experience built not on escalation, but on persistent informational imbalance, a structure that denies resolution by design. Fear is often discussed as reaction, but as these films demonstrate, it is more accurately understood as result. Each example we've examined relies on a specific constraint: a decision to limit information, restrict space, delay clarity, or deny orientation. None of these effects are accidental. They are engineered outcomes of design choices that prioritize control over comfort. So the question moving forward is not which film scared you the most. It's which technical decision surprised you the most. Was it the use of silence? The refusal to explain? The manipulation of space-time or behavior? And which horror film do you think deserves closer technical analysis, not for what it shows, but for how it's built? Let us know your thoughts.